It's time to lighten up today. My sermons the last few weeks have been kind of serious and kind of heavy, and so I wanted to have some fun today. Now this week is Thanksgiving week. That's my favorite holiday of the whole year. I love a chance to give thanks to God for all the blessings we've been given and gather with friends and family for a wonderful feast. This is also the time of the year when the readings assigned in church have to do with eschatology, a word that means the last things, judgment, death, resurrection, the end of the world. Well, there's something that sort of brings that all together, and it's an old favorite story of mine, and I love this story. It was written by a Presbyterian minister named Michael Lindvall. Now, he served small Presbyterian churches out in the Midwest. This story may be fiction, but it's based on how things really work in small churches. This story could have been written about the little church I served in Pennsylvania before I met all of you. I love this story. It's a for real fictional story, and it's called Rapture. Thanksgiving Sunday was coming up, the Sunday right before Thanksgiving, when every preacher worth his or her salt talks about giving thanks. I was getting ready to write a sermon, trying to be a little creative with the old theme, when I was struck down by the flu. I had the shakes, a headache, a sore throat, and then every preacher's nightmare, laryngitis. By Friday at noon, I could only croak monosyllables like vex. There was only one thing to do, unfortunately, and that was to call on the only spare preacher in a radius of 50 miles who would climb into a pulpit on such short notice, the Reverend Lex Ardent. He's a retired clergyman who spent his working days as an evangelist on what was left of the old Sawdust Trail, the tent meeting revival ministry circuit that is the ancestor of television ministry. His church is called the Apostolic Church of the Divine Christ in God, which broke off from a splinter group of a sect whose name involves all those words just in a different order. I knew Lex through the local clergy association. He moved here when he retired 6 years ago and now lives with his son. Lex's theology had been strongly influenced by the woollier and more wild-eyed of the Old Testament prophets with their thunderings against idolatry and corruption and all the sins of the flesh. From this point in the Bible, Lex's religious thinking did a graceless leap over the Gospels but landed squarely in the book of Revelation. It was well known in town that Lex had only one sermon. He had gotten away with this over a 45-year career because he was forever moving from one tent meeting to the next. If the Sawdust Trail happened to bring him back to the same town again, Lex believed that a person who had been saved by his sermon the first time around through would not need to be present the second time. If someone did return, the sermon must not have worked the first time, so the listener could well stand to hear it again. Lex's lone sermon was about the rapture, that esoteric doctrine beloved by those of an apocalyptic spirit. This doctrine says that at the second coming of Christ, all true and faithful followers, literally numbered at 144,000, will be plucked live and whole from wherever they happen to be at that unexpected moment and whisked into the kingdom. On the rear of his rusty Buick LeSabre, Lex has a bumper sticker that says, "In case of rapture, driver will disappear." That bumper sticker is the core of Lex's theology and pretty much the whole point of his sermon. In the sermon, Lex paints a dozen verbal pictures of people gathered together in various places, from which one of them always only one, would suddenly and without warning disappear. People are waiting in line at the supermarket, and all of a sudden, the checkout girl is gone. The rapture. A 7th grader in the second row at school suddenly vanishes. The rapture. Folks are shopping at an auto parts store, and suddenly the guy standing in line is simply gone, leaving behind the 2 new snow tires he's never going to need. The rapture. Then, in darker tones, Lex would describe a church service. Sunday morning worshipers gathered together, and only one of them is raptured, and it might not be the preacher. Now, in this school of preaching, Lex is a master. He launches his sermon slowly and quietly, and then climbs gradually into sermonic frenzy. It is, of course, designed to scare the bejabbers out of his listeners, most of whom, on brief self-examination, realize that they will be left behind, as Lex calls them. Now that he's off the sawdust trail and on the substitute preacher circuit, Lex has developed a knack for adapting this sermon to any and every occasion. If it's a Christmas sermon, he brings his listeners back down by saying with something like, "It was to save us from being left behind that God sent Jesus to be born." If it's an Easter sermon, Lex says, "It was to save us from being left behind that God raised Christ from the dead." Now, when Lex preached his Thanksgiving sermon to my Presbyterian church on that Sunday, I was there. I was really too ill and laryngitic to preach myself, but I was not sick enough to stay home in bed. Frankly, I was curious as to how Lex would work his sermon around Thanksgiving. I underestimated him. The day found Lex in fine form. As he preached, he wandered away from the pulpit, waving his hands about and pointing theatrically in the direction of the ceiling. He has no need for notes after all these years. Lex worked slowly into his great crescendo, jabbing at the heavens with both index fingers, painting pictures of lukewarm, Sunday-only Christians with disappointed looks on their faces as they saw the few and the true swept up in the rapture. Now, all of this was a great novelty to my politely listening Presbyterians, who rarely let themselves get swept up into anything, much less rhetoric like this sermon. After 25 minutes of preaching, Lex ended his sermon by slicing the air with his fingers, closing his eyes, and shouting, "Thank God! Thank God! Thank God in this season of Thanksgiving that it's not too late for any of you in this room." When he sat down, he looked exhausted. This was work for a younger man. Sweat was pouring down his temples. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his brow. And then he closed his eyes, threw his head back, and stretched his legs out in front of him. Lex told me that he liked the sermon to be the last thing in the service except for the closing hymn. He struggled to his feet to sing that hymn, pushing himself up from the big mahogany preacher's chair. His eyes were still half closed, as though he were not yet descended from his homiletical high. Now, Lex had picked the hymn, "Come, Lord, and Tarry Not." We had never sung it before, so most of the sound was coming from the direction of the choir. "Come, Lord, and tarry not, bring the longed-for day. Oh, why these years of waiting here, these ages of delay?" Our choir is made up of 8 ladies and 1 gentleman, and they recess out of the church during the closing hymn. In my church, we have no center aisle, and if they were to go down via one of the side aisles, they would find themselves going out the front doors into 20-degree weather. So they leave the choir loft, which is up front on the left, And they march across the back of the chancel behind the big communion table and out the right rear door and into the Westminster room where they head straight for the big coffee pot. Now, this is a direct route, but it's narrow and it has one hazard. There is a wooden grate in the floor directly behind the communion table. The grate measures 2.5 feet square. It's made of pine, and it's just set in the hole in the floor that opens to the heating duct below. The duct bends at a right angle 3 feet down and then continues on to the old hot air furnace. Emma Bowers is a soprano, and she's new to our choir. She's a small woman. She gives herself another 3 inches of height by wearing spiked high-heeled shoes. As she passed over the heating grate that Sunday morning, her right heel went into one of the little square holes and lodged there, tight. The processing choir, hymn books in front of their faces, slowed as Emma tugged to free her foot. I guess the shoes were old and tight. Her shoe stayed on, and the heel did not break off. On her third and mighty pull, Emma lifted that whole grate, which really wasn't very heavy, right out of the duct and moved on, trooper that she is, walking like she'd been shot in the leg, but trying not to notice. Now, right behind her came Della Johnson. Della, to put it kindly, does not have a keen awareness of her immediate environment. She can see just fine, she just never seems to notice things. I turned to see if Lex had noticed Emma plowing along, determined to make it to the rear door, as if nothing had happened. He looked over just to watch as Della stepped to where the grate was not. She gave a little squealing whoop and just disappeared from sight behind the communion table. Lex dropped his jaw in a flabbergasted gape. His eyes went wide. He dropped his hymn book and he shut his eyes tight. The Rapture! Still in the grip of his sermonic euphoria, he saw before his very eyes the scene he had been putting into words for 45 years. The rapture had happened. Della was taken and he was left behind. This state of flabbergasted confusion lasted for maybe 4 seconds. That must have been the longest 4 seconds in Lex's life. His look then shifted from horror to confusion to immense relief. He closed his eyes and mouthed what surely must have been a prayer of earnest thanksgiving that the apocalypse was delayed. Della had not even fallen over, but rather stepped square into that duct and went down the 3 feet to where it turns horizontal. There was not a scratch on her. To this day, I don't think she realizes what actually happened. A dozen people ran to rescue her. They fished her out and they dusted her off. And after things settled down, I stood in front of the congregation and I croaked, "She's okay." And then I whispered a hoarse blessing and dismissal. I went home exhausted. I ate a whole bag of potato chips and went to bed. About 8 o'clock that evening, I woke up feeling much better. The worst of the flu aches were over, and my mental picture of those 4 seconds in the life of Lex Ardent, my mental picture was becoming a great joy to me. I thought of Della vanishing with a whoop, and then I thought of other dear people who have vanished just as suddenly from my life. My grandparents, an older uncle, my best friend from seminary. I took a shower, I put on my bathrobe and looked at myself in the mirror. I imagined myself disappearing into the floor with a whoop, and I said to myself, "Pastor, you don't have much in the bank, and you don't even own the house you live in. But here you are, getting gray and lumpy. You might never have been born. You have no right to have been born, but here you are. And I went to kiss our 6-year-old boy goodnight. He was only half asleep, and he pulled me down beside him with little arms and big love. I crawled into his bed as he fell asleep. I could hear his breathing, his mouth open, and I could feel his heart beating with his chest tight against my side. He might not have been, but he is. And lying there, it all fell into place. The troubles of my life, the troubles in the lives of all of us in church that Sunday morning were as nothing compared with the gracious gift of life here and now. This is indeed the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it, and let us give thanks. Amen.